Here we go. So welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. Myself, Julie Lancaster, as the host, where we're getting to learn and hear from Ivy Banks. Will you, if your video is on, if you wouldn't mind turning on your video, we would love to see you for at least for a moment even. Will you raise your physical hand if you know or have heard of Ivy? She's kind of famous around these parts. So it's true. We are so lucky and honored to be learning from her today. There are a few things that I want to share before we get started, before we start everything. The first is if you can find the chat and tell us why you are here today, what inspired you to sign up. Go ahead and write that in the chat and see what everybody's saying. There's a lot of incredible things that people are saying. I'm also going to stop sharing so that we can all see each other. Oh my gosh, this is thrilling. Where did all your faces just go? I know you're, oh, there. They just, oh my gosh. Oh, look at, Ivy, do you see all these incredible folks?
I see these incredible folks. I'm so excited. Melissa Welker, hello. Hi, Macy. Hi, Terry Hayes. I'm so excited to see these faces. I'm almost teary-eyed. It seems like such a long time when we can get together. So this is such a great space to be able to have these brave conversations and to see everyone. So excited to see these faces.
Wonderful. So Ivy, thank you so much for taking your time. We know that you are busy, and so we're delighted to be here together. Will everybody take a moment? This is going to be so fun. Will everybody unmute all at the same time for just 5 seconds and tell everybody on this call, on top of each other, whatever you want to say to them, whether it's a welcome or something else lovely, in 5, 4, 3, 2, go.
So inspired by
Hi,
all
you're
of you,
beautiful.
everybody.
Love it.
Talking with you.
Hello.
Fun. Exciting to see each other.
Wonderful. I hope you heard some of those messages, got to share.
I love you
Oh,
all.
Julie, I think you froze.
Yeah.
Amazing, Julie. Hello, can you hear us, Julie? Oh boy, I think you froze. 1 second, I'm going to start doing some administrative tasks and start letting folks into, because I think Julie will also need to be let back in. So if you give me 1 second to switch to let folks in and admit everyone, including our amazing host. I'm admitting everyone, so if you give me 1 moment, switching over to admin roles. While I do that, everyone just look around the room, our virtual room, and see all the amazing folks and amazing faces that joined us today. All right, here comes the amazing Julie, the incomparable. Every time we have an event, I have to try to match her energy, and I never can get there, so. I think she's joining us again.
I have no idea what just happened. I think
There she is.
I think I just crashed the system by everybody asking everyone to unmute. I almost just fainted and passed out because I was just gone from the meeting. I'm glad you're all still here, and we keep going. That's Alicia, being able to continue even when a little bit of madness is happening around us. So with that, if you wouldn't mind all going ahead and muting, but here we go with this conversation. I want you to start getting questions ready. I want you to prime some of your questions. If you've got some of them already in your mind, you'll have this opportunity to ask questions because we're having a conversation today. And I want to share a few details with you about Ivy. You read her bio. You may know her. She's so fantastic. she was the one. I have to share this with you. She was the one that I called when this conversation about race and social justice and racial justice and all of these things were coming up. I called and said, Ivy, I need your help. Help me to know how to move forward. How can I communicate best with my people? And so she said, let's have this conversation. So I want to share a few things. You already read her bio, but I want to tell you how especially incredible she is. So not only is she a lawyer, she's also the associate vice president.
Oh, Julie. Oh, no. Here we grow again, right? Well, I'll share a little bit because I want to make sure that we maximize your time and maximize the opportunity that we have here. So I'm sure Julie is going to share with you that I am the Associate Vice President of Student Affairs and Dean of Students at Northern Arizona University. I focus on inclusive excellence, and that's where my niche is. I enjoy having these conversations, and today I'm going to talk for about 10 or 15 minutes, and we're going to have open questions and dialogue because it's really important for us to practice some of those techniques and tools that we're going to talk through today. And so if you don't mind for a moment, I'm just going to share my screen with you. I just have a few talking points, but mostly we are going to, one moment. We're going to talk about what does it mean? What are we talking about civil discourse? And we talk about all of these things. And if you don't remember, I don't know if you recall going through social studies when you were in 4th grade and we had these discussions and said, we're going to go through and we're going to have some civil discourse. And I remember going through and doing some of these practices with classmates. And guess what? I didn't pick it up again in college. I didn't pick it up again in high school. I didn't pick it up in my master's program for both of them. And I didn't even pick it up in my Juris Doctorate program. So as we have these conversations, it's important to understand the framework from where each of us is approaching this. So what does it mean to have civil discourse? What are we talking about when we talk about social unrest and the current situation in the current state? I'm going to start with this. And this is a quote that you may have seen, again, if you've gone through a process of talking about civil discourse. When the fabric of society is so rigid that it cannot change quickly enough, adjustments are achieved by social unrest and revolutions. That was a quote by John Boyd Orr, and we see that quote a lot as we're talking about civil discourse and going through this idea of what do we mean that we talk civilly and what are we talking about as it relates to society. I'm going to pause throughout this discussion to ask questions of you, so I'm going to ask that you unmute yourselves, and I'm hoping that you can. If not, if you can type it into the chat box. When we talk about the fabric of society is so rigid that it cannot change quickly enough, what does that mean? What do we mean by that statement? It cannot change quickly enough. What do it mean by rigid? Joseph Carter, I see your hand raised. Please feel free to unmute yourself and jump in.
A lot of things came to mind, but I feel like one of the biggest things is people's perspectives. I feel like a lot of people might be caught up in the same mindset and just creates a really strong rigidness.
A strong rigid, when we're talking about individuality, absolutely. When we talk about the idea of oppression and we think about the levels in the eyes of oppression, and that's a training that we do separately. But one of those things is the individual. Yes, very much so. I saw there was a couple of other unmutes. What are some other thoughts?
Fear.
Fear. And can you tell me who said that, please?
Valerie.
Thank you, Valerie. Absolutely. And what do you mean by fear?
Fear that for a lot of people, that when change comes, especially in the environment that we're having layers of change that are taking place. And for folks, your immediate reaction oftentimes to change is fear, but when it comes in layers, even more so, you're looking for something that you can hold on to, that you feel is normal as things are changing. But because we've had civil unrest happen at the same time we've had a pandemic, people are really, it's unsettling for them. What do I hold on to? What is my perspective? And because we're isolating, you're trying to figure out what's the normal group that I would talk to that would help me figure out this change, and how do I adapt and understand and grow from it?
Absolutely. Perfect. Thank you. I should have you as my co-host today. I love it. Yes. So we talk about fear and the fear of the unknown. One of the things we talk about when we go through a more in-depth training is we talk about bias and unconscious bias. Some of those are rooted in the fact of who we are as animal, our animalistic nature, and that we fear the unknown. Part of fearing an unknown means that we react. Sometimes our reaction is, I will do a physical reaction, you'll see it. Sometimes my reaction is, I don't know enough about it, so I shut down my mental, meaning that I won't even be open enough to be able to have a conversation because I'm so afraid of where it might take me. So it's important for us to acknowledge that. And it's important, as we go back to what Joe's statement was that it's individual. But I also want to point out that when we talk about society, that means that it's also institutional, right? It's those institutions that we love that we have to admit that there's some rigidity there. And what are some of the institutions that we love? Just shout them out, unmute yourself, feel free.
Healthcare,
Education, yes. Keep going. Healthcare, education, religion,
food
society.
industry.
What's that?
Food industry, our
Yes.
network of food delivery.
Our networks, housing.
Political representation.
Political, yes, representation. When we think about all of these pieces and aspects, again, that's institutional. And sometimes it's hard for us when we're facing not only the fear individually, but how can I admit, number one, that perhaps my beliefs in this institution were ill-founded? The institution of American society. When I say about this, is talking about the fabric of society, those things that make up society, those things that we pledge ourselves to, those things that we say that we believe in without conviction and that we're taught from kindergarten and before, of this civic duty and this mindedness of this greatness. And not to say that we're great, but also to say that if we have a society that we're starting to question, that's when that fear comes into place. And sometimes when we're thinking about it from a place of fear, right, we get uncomfortable. And the biggest thing that you will hear, I will say this as a bumper sticker, if you have any conversations with me, anybody that's talked to me before, they will know that I say you have to be comfortable being uncomfortable. Because some of those oppressions and isms that are woven so tightly into the fabric of our society, they're woven so tightly into the fabric of our society, it's hard for us to separate the two. It is hard for us to separate this institution, the society, this fabric that we love and hold so dear, and we were taught to revere, and to say, there might be aspects here that I am supposed to question. There might be aspects here and adjustments that need to be made. And we get to that next part of that sentence, adjustments, right? Saying that I may have to adjust the thinking that this institution, this fabric, this part of me that's been so woven so tightly, closely into my identity, into the identity again that I pledge myself to, that there might have to be adjustments. There might have to be adjustments in order for us to achieve truly the essence, the fabric of society that we're meant to be, or that we want to be, or that we hold ourselves out to be. And we talk about social unrest and revolutions. We go into this more in depth when we talk about this in our very lengthy trainings. But one of the things that we see as a part of a democratic society is understanding that we pledge allegiance to a republic. What does a republic mean? What do I mean when I say we pledge allegiance to a republic? Does anybody know? If I look that up, what does republic mean?
Representative democracy.
A supreme power.
A supreme power, interesting. All right. What are other thoughts?
An administration for the people.
An administration for the people, okay. Other thoughts?
Representational government.
representational. When we talk about a republic, the definition, you had various thoughts of it, yes, is that we're looking at a supreme power that's held by who? The people. I saw you, Johnny, that said that, or Joni, I'm sorry. The people, right? So when the people speak, right, we're saying that it's when we're pledge allegiance to the republic and we go through this idea of the fabric of society, our people, those that make up the society have the right to be able to speak, to ensure that that there are adjustments made, However, what we have to understand and get through is how do we have that conversation and what do we mean by making those adjustments through the voices of the people? And how do we look at that from both the institutional lens, the societal lens, the four eyes of oppression, and look at it from the individual lens? Today, we're going to focus on the individual lens and say, what does that mean? How do I talk to you about something personal so that you can understand my vantage point so that we can get to those adjustments? How do I talk to you about something personal? What do I mean by that? So what is civil discourse? We talk about civil discourse. There's multiple definitions. I use this from the Charles Cook Institute. Civil discourse is a conversation with a serious purpose. It is a conversation that looks to find shared opportunity, not conflict. It is a conversation that looks to remove barriers, not build new ones. It is a conversation that instead of becoming paralyzed by our disagreements, uses them to propel creative solutions and alternatives. Some questions that I want to ask of you as we start to think about this idea of what civil discourse is. And there's, again, lots of definitions as relate to civil discourse. A conversation with serious purpose. Many of our conversations right now are around race, racism, ableism, socioeconomic status, all of the isms that oppression has brought forth and visualized to us on social media and in different mediums. It is a conversation that looks to find shared opportunity. What do we mean by shared opportunity?
Win-win.
Win-win? Oh, I'm
Yeah.
sorry, what was that?
Win-win. It's a win-win proposition rather than a win-lose.
Rather than a win-lose, absolutely. It is this question, and have you heard of the question of, and I'm going to go back to the other slide. Is it a debate, discussion, or a dialogue? What's the difference? Yes, a dialogue, yes. Why is it not a debate or a discussion? What's the difference between those three?
Well, dialogue, you have people with like a mutual ground. Well, maybe not necessarily mutual ground, but a dialogue, you're kind of, it's like a civil conversation. You know, a debate, you're kind of going back and forth and you're trying to convince the other person to agree with your opinion or your statement.
When we're talking about a debate, absolutely. And please feel free to join in and jump in with questions. And I can't see everyone. So I know Julie is going to be looking around for hands raised. And also please feel free to unmute and join in the conversation. We're talking about a debate. I am, as a lawyer, I debate in the courtroom. That means when I come in with a position that I want to win. I come in, I listen to your argument, and while I'm listening to your argument, I am finding ways to attack it. I am not looking to accept your argument. I come in with the proposition that your argument is wrong and my argument is right. And it works well in the courtroom because we are defending lives. It works well in the courtroom because we're defending property. But when we're talking about a civility, we're talking about engaging with neighbors, engaging in the workplace. We want to transition to, again, a dialogue. When, again, I go back to debate about winning and losing, I come in and I am attacking the argument. So every word I'm looking to attack, every proposition I am looking to attack because my end game is that I want to win. The issue is when we're debating, it means that there is no room for dialogue. There is no room for discussion. I continue to shut you down. And my position is that I am right no matter what you say. For many of us, what we're seeing on social media is the debate. We are saying, I am right and you are wrong. And there is no room for anything else but I am right and you are wrong. When we go back to this idea of civility and to engage with this idea of civility, does that mean that I have to be polite? Does that mean that it is free from emotion?
No.
No.
You have to be respectful.
That's what it is.
That's what it is. It's having this idea of respect. It is having this idea that I want to engage in a healthy political argument is to acknowledge the possibility that one's own argument could be falsified or proven wrong. This demands that citizens listen respectfully to the claims made by others. Name callings, threats, and bullying behaviors do not meet the demands of effective deliberation. So in order for us to get to a peace, again, to the place of dialogue versus debate, we have to come in with a position of learning. The idea is connectivity to community. When we talk about civil discourse, the definition came from Cicero at the top of the page. If you can see, I can't even see the top of my page actually. It is talking about the good of the city, the good of the whole, the good of all. And when we have these conversations and we are talking about police brutality, we are talking about race, we are talking about death and life. So no, it means that we will have emotion, that we will not approach it from an emotionless stance, but it means that we will be civil. Does that mean, again, that I have to be polite?
Make sure. I think you have to have, whatever the conversation is, what helps is that you have to have house rules so that everybody agrees to them.
You know the next step. When I come in and before I even engage, so if David and Borsham and I were about to have this conversation, my very first opening would be, David, we are talking about race and we are talking about my positionality. I am invested in this because I'm invested in it personally, and I'm also invested in it because of my family and because of the community that I love. So I'm coming in and letting you know that I will have emotion, but I want to hear your position, and I would like for you to be able to hear my position, knowing that I am going to be approaching it from a place of emotion. But I also want to be able to listen and to actively listen and to engage with you because this is important. What was I able to show David with that intro or with that discussion point before we even began?
Mutual respect.
Mutual respect?
Yes.
Willingness to hear his side.
Yes.
Perspectives about where you're coming from and why you have the stance why you have the stance you have.
Mm-hmm.
I showed some of my personal investment in the discussion and why that was important for me, because some of this is also leading through the lens of empathy and discussing through the lens of empathy and understanding that position. I grew up, and I always share this story, right? I grew up in a Black neighborhood. I went to a mixed school that was actually mostly Black. My parents were Black and African-American. I went to a Black African-American church. I pledged a Black and African-American sorority. How did I learn about having conversations? How did I learn about having dialogue? What lens did I see it through?
Through your parents.
Through my parents? Through what else?
Your teachers.
My teachers?
Community,
My community?
peers,
What's that?
peers,
Peers?
Friends.
Friends? We didn't get much of this in our education system, but what also is important there is I learned it from people that were just like me. I learned it from my culture. So as we are having these conversations, it's important to understand the position of where the other person that you're talking to or where the other group is coming from. It's important to make room for empathy, and it's important to make room for other viewpoints. Because if you're coming from a different viewpoint than what I explained, if you didn't also grow up in that same or similar circumstance, then your vantage point and your viewpoint will be different. So it's important to acknowledge that, because it's important to acknowledge that when we're talking about intersections of race, class, gender, our communication habits are also impacted by our culture. You see how I raise my voice and I go back and forth?
Yeah.
That's because that's what I saw my mother do. When I go into conversations, as opposed to yelling, my mother's voice went like this, and it was stern. So it's important to understand and acknowledge that piece. Why? Why is that important?
Those things can be misinterpreted from people outside your culture.
Yes. It can be misinterpreted.
You can't have a dialogue if you don't understand others' perspectives.
It may, you may see me doing like this, and you saying, well, Ivy's so aggressive and she's angry. Versus there's cultural differences here, and acknowledging those cultural differences, respecting those cultural differences. What else could you notice, or why is that important to understand?
Well, it can also help you facilitate dialogue also, to kind of know maybe like where you need to like lay back, or, you know, like kind of keep low on some of your actions or some of your verbal tics or so.
It helps me to think how I approach the dialogue and I approach the conversation. Yes.
You know, what's interesting, just as we're talking about this, that if you're doing this at work, then it's almost like part of your house rules has to be suspending the work norm for how you communicate, because in the workplace there's that conformity, and so everybody is trying to talk similar or the same way. But if we're really going to have the meaningful discussion and have people become vulnerable, then the house rule has to say we're suspending the regular work talk, you know, the way we do things, and we probably need to talk a little bit about how we communicate differently, so that as we move forward, it can help on terms of interpretation and misinterpretation.
Yes, and absolutely. And that has to be woven into the fabric of the culture. And there's a couple things I'll say to that. And as we go through that and understand, people ask, why is it that you do training, and why is it important to do cultural competency training? Why is it important to have that when you're doing the onboarding, and not only through the onboarding, but regularly in the job and in the workplace? It is because we have to understand that we don't have a prescriptive approach, number one, and your authentic self should be able to show up in the workplace. You should be able to show up in your authentic self and to be able to share and communicate. And one of the things with speaking through civil discourse is that the differences are so profound that we can't have a prescriptive approach that will work. You have to have open discussions that we acknowledge these differences, and meta conversations, right? That are happening all at the same time. But yes.
And I think sometimes it's hard because for a lot of people, if they weren't exposed or had a school that had various cultures, sometimes parents just didn't talk about it. They didn't acknowledge that there's differences, you know, the saying, oh, we don't see color, but that's almost in a way more damaging because people are afraid then to bring it up. So I think a lot of people are scared to acknowledge it, like they're going to say the wrong thing, et cetera. So I think sometimes, you know, for a lot of people that, you know, there's ways of approaching it, but they're scared. They want to, you know, say that, you know, it's a good thing because that means they don't care if somebody's from a different culture or color, but at the same time, you know, when it may be very important to talk about those things, they're afraid and don't know how to approach it.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a very valid point. And I think that it's one of those reasons why we talk about after Brown versus Board of Education, after we had all of these amazing Supreme Court cases, even in the past few weeks, you've seen the Supreme Court has made some amazing decisions that are impacting many members of our community, from our DACA to our LGBTQIA+, and we'll continue to see that. But one of the things that we see is that we didn't make changes and adjustments in our workplace. We just said, okay, we're going to have we didn't do it in higher education either. We said, we're just going to admit different people. We're going to hire different people, but we didn't change our practices and policies to be able to respect and have this inclusion. And inclusion is that action word where it says, no matter who you are, no matter what it is no matter who you are and who you represent, our environment will be made so much that you value who you are is valued. What you bring to the table is valued. And we've done away, we didn't go to the realm of inclusion. We're just now having the conversations about inclusive workplaces. And it requires us to completely go back and to have that conversation of how do we change the fabric of who we are? Because I, in many cases, can't show up as my authentic self at work. And I can't have that authentic voice at work because that voice hasn't been amplified enough to have that respect at the table. And I always go back to say that we live in a beautiful world. If I would remiss to say that one of the things that I do enjoy is being able to see the sunrise and the sunset. And I'm so blessed to be able to have that ability and to be able to see all of the colors that are manifested because of the sunrise and the sunset. And when I go to different settings, whether it be on the mountain or down here in the valley, how that looks differently. And if I were to say that I don't see color, what am I missing in this beautiful world? So that's why it's important for us to say that I do see it, I do acknowledge it, because the way that we see the world would be transformed if we can say that I do see it, I acknowledge it, I respect it, and more importantly, I value it. Because that's how you're able to bring your authentic self. And that's how we'll begin to be able to hear each other. One of the things that we see in the workplace is that the underlying systemic isms that are at play when we're talking about having civil discourse. And one of those is the marginalized voices aren't amplified. That goes back to, I can't show up to be my authentic self. So how do we change our systems so that we can show up and that we can be our authentic selves and that we can have the conversations that we need to have to push forward? The other thing is, as you were talking about, Heather, is you have to get comfortable being uncomfortable. We weren't taught this, so it's important to bring in professionals of diversity and inclusion to teach us how to do it. It is important to say, here's what we need in order to get started. Here's how you can look at it a little differently. Here's how you can have talking sessions and brown bags. And some of the things that we've seen work in companies like Google and companies, larger corporations like Coca-Cola, Microsoft, is having the brown bag series focused on diversity. Having ERGs or employees that are able to have the ability to get together and talk about the experiences from their lens and share that up with management. It's important to be able to have diversity trainings during the onboarding process and at regular intervals, because it's in these safe spaces, not on the floor, not when we're working and we're in our silos and I'm on my laptop and my computer and answering calls. It's when we stop and take a time out and carve out the space to be able to have these brave conversations in the workplace. And that requires us to actually do it, to say we are going to have 2 hours a month, or we're going to have an hour a month dedicated to having civil discourse around issues of diversity and inclusion. Even having Heritage Month recognitions, and to be able to not just put up decorations, but having time where we spend time acknowledging why we have the Heritage Month celebrations, why it's important, and what we can use from that in order to change our practices. hasn't been part of our education, so that's why we fear it. We go back to that early conversation. When we talk about bias, it's the fear of the unknown, the fear of, I don't know how to do this, so I won't do it. And that's usually where we also see it when we talk about culture versus nurture. When I talk about how I was raised, and what my vantage point for approaching arguments was, and why I speak a lot with my hands, right? And then assimilation versus celebrating differences. Important for us to recognize that we need to see color, that we can't live in a colorblind world, because when we open our eyes every day, we see beautiful colors. So it's important for us to acknowledge that and to be able to celebrate that, not only in the workplace, but with our neighbors, by not putting up barriers. I saw recently where a neighbor received a letter from an anonymous neighbor that said, if you put up a Black Lives Matter sign in your yard, because they were the only Black neighbor, family or neighbor family in the neighborhood, that we've already spoken as a neighborhood and we've decided that we don't want that here. So do not put that up. Civil discourse, again, is having the ability to be able to say what we have to look at, what's the better good for society. And that means we approach it with understanding that my arguments, my position may not be the best position for society as a whole. So how do I approach it from a place of learning, understanding that it has serious purpose, knowing that civil discourse is the traffic laws, right? That can help us ensure we avoid the social pileups that we want to avoid. But civility is the machine oil that keeps the gears of our society running smoothly. So we approach it with civility, we approach it with respect, but it's important for us to approach it and to acknowledge it. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing, and I would like to open up the floor. I know that it's a very quick time. We spend about 4 hours together. We go much more in depth into these issues of bias and oppression, and we spend time on the eyes of oppression, and we spend time on really understanding some of those unspoken rules that we don't discuss. But here, very short time, I know, but I want to open it up to any questions that you may have that hopefully I'll be able to answer as well.
So Ivy, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, so there's a question there from Kate, and she asks, do you have any advice on how to respectfully create a civil discourse with someone close to you who starts off the conversation proud and blatant about their racist beliefs?
A couple of different ways. Number one, most of those are best approached when you have a rapport with someone and you're able to have an honest conversation. And again, when we're talking about a civil discourse and a civil conversation, it doesn't mean that there won't be emotion involved, but it means that there has to be respect and honesty. So from your position, you have to be honest about where you stand. One of the things that I see is the likes, and someone goes, well, I'm not even going to approach that. So you have to, number one, be honest about where you stand, and you have to be brave enough to be able to have that conversation. What I mean by brave is that our allies and allyship is important right now. And that means that when we aren't in the room, meaning those people of color, the LGBTQIA community, different able people, when we're not in the room, we need you to speak up on our behalf. That's what true allyship means. It means that you will be active and you will speak up not only when I'm present, but when I am not. So approaching that with some brave space, approaching that with honesty, and approaching that depending upon that rapport that you have with that person. I'll give you a very quick story because I know that there's questions coming in. I had a administrative assistant who went to the leadership of the university. I was teaching at the law school, and I was also serving as an administrator. And I needed some additional administrative support. So the dean said, I found someone, we'll be able to move forward. A couple of days later, the dean said, we have a problem. The person that I approached about the opportunity is apprehensive because they know about your support for Black Lives Matter. and they're a little bit apprehensive that that conflicts with their own personal beliefs. And I said, oh, okay, no problem. It took me a minute to take that in and start to think through what that means. So I asked if I'd be able to take that person out and just have a discussion with them. I did. And she was very apprehensive at first because she thought I was going to come approaching it like this and pointing fingers. But I approached it with, let's talk about where we begin, because I know we have a common place, right? Let's talk about what it is and how we get to the point until we diverge. And so we started to have that conversation, and she said, well, my husband is a police officer and I want him to come home every night to me. And I said, well, guess what? My spouse is not a police officer, but I want him to come home every night to me. So we're starting from a common core and saying that the core is that my position and my belief is based upon the person that I love so much that I want to protect them. But we're diverging because we're not exploring, or you're not exploring further what that conversation means, both on my behalf and on behalf of that organization. So we did. We ended up spending 3 hours. It was supposed to be a 30-minute lunch. I missed the rest of my afternoon. But part of that is because we were able to have that dialogue away from the noise. I didn't do it on social media. I pulled them aside and I was able to have that conversation in private. I did that not at her desk. I didn't do it around the rest of the administrative team. I took her out and we went out to have coffee in a very private place. It allowed her to take down her walls and her defenses, and it allowed me to take down my walls and my defenses. And we were able to share that we have a common ground. We have a common starting point. So where do we diverge? We later still may not agree all the way on Black Lives Matter, and we don't, but we are able to get to a place where we respect each other's position and we respect that even though our points diverge, we were able to have a civil conversation, despite the fact that we didn't walk away on the same page.
That's incredible. Thank you for the stories. I think for me are especially helpful just to hear in real life, how do you do this? A couple of other questions have come in. One from Robin that says, in civil discourse, how best do you deal with non-fact generalizations or stereotypes when both sides think that they know everything as their truth? And then a question that came in privately that maybe could dovetail, how can we have respectful conversations between staff and faculty? I think even more broadly at work.
Mm-hmm. I'll go back to the first one first with the non-facts, and that happens a lot, Robin. And usually in those situations, if we can't get to a happy medium or to a happy place during the conversation while we're having it face to face, or I'll say Zoom to Zoom, what I'll do is say, while I appreciate that fact, I'm going to jot it down because I just want to make sure I remember it. You're saying that there was 6 people killed by officers this year, and that's it. Okay, no problem. I jot it down and I said, I'm going to go back and take a look at that and rethink some things. Usually what I'm doing with that is using that to be able to go back and provide more information. And so I usually will say, thank you for sharing that statistic. I was unable to find that statistic that you quoted. However, I was able to find these 6 statistics from like the CDC and some very reputable places. I don't say reputable, but I do say from like the CDC and all of these .edu and .govs. To be able to give you some more background and information. Perhaps this will help you as you move forward. Again, we may not be able, because we know how to have civil discourse, doesn't mean that the person across from us does. So we have to remember to stay in civility and to continue with the discourse, because if we get them shutting down, then we walked away with somebody that will remain ignorant forever. And as educators, what I always say that as educators, our goal is to ensure that I'm leading someone always away from ignorance. And that goal may not get there at that moment when I'm having that conversation, but for some, it takes time, and it takes them developing a rapport with me and a trust with me. It takes me continuing to go back and say, I did look at that statistic again, or I did look at that information, and I did consider your point. And while I found that it was an interesting point and a good point, here's some information for you to think about as well. So making sure that I follow that up and that I have that information readily available. And then when I think about the second part of that question, I was trying to find it, Julie.
It was written privately.
Oh, okay. Can you say that again, please?
Yes, absolutely. So first of all, I just have to comment on your tact. The way that you are sharing how to converse about that is just filled with tact, and it's just really inspiring. I feel like all of us could even be writing down the specific words to say, use this language because it's so helpful. That question was, how can we have respectful conversations between staff and faculty, or maybe even just generally at work?
And I will tell you, Julie, sometimes I am so angry that I am shaking when I am having those conversations and I'm ready to throw something or jump across the table. But I know that the way that there are stereotypes of Black women in society, that if I approach it with anger, that person might shut down. I know that if that will perpetuate, right, stereotypes. So it's important for me to constantly think through those things and ensure that I'm, again, leading away from ignorance. I would say that it's a culture change, to answer the question, that you have to be willing to change the culture. So when we're talking about and having these conversations at work, it's important to do them in spaces that are created for those conversations. So that requires administration. It requires us to create those conversations. If we happen to be having those amongst friends and colleagues, it's important to be able to know the space and to be able to know what some of those limitations are. And I think Valerie mentioned that, that before we can really have those honest conversations, we have to be able to create those spaces. So that requires the institution to do something. The other piece is to create the spaces. So if you are sitting in a position of privilege and everyone's like, what does that mean? If you have a job, if you are a president of an organization, if you are, that means you are sitting in a position of privilege. And you can say, hey, just like Julie did, we are going to carve out an hour of time in a week and we are going to talk about this. So you can do that at work. You can do that in your positions of privilege. And if you feel like you don't have the power, reach out to a colleague, reach out to a friend, get a co-faculty or a co-staff member, administrator that would be happy to be able to do that and do that lifting for you as well. So create the space. The other piece is coming into these conversations specifically about race and the social unrest that we're approaching, and knowing that it is personal and we are asking America to check itself from the things that they hid from the world for so long. These are the things that we hid up under the carpet when our friends came to visit. These are those things, and I know you've had them in your family where we say, we just will not talk about this. This is what we're talking about in America. We're talking about those things that we said we would never talk about. So that's what makes this so uncomfortable for so many. So you have to be able to push and to be able to have those conversations. That means you have to get uncomfortable as well.
Actually, that brings up one of these next questions from Kristen that ties in so well. What about the people who don't want to get uncomfortable, perhaps yet? The question is, any advice on how to approach someone who's apathetic about racial injustice, who just doesn't want to ruffle feathers since it doesn't affect him or her?
Absolutely. When trainings are required, that means everyone has to be there. When trainings are required, no matter what your position on those issues are, you are required to spend that time thinking through those issues. You may go through them fast, you may click through it, but you had to complete it. And again, I go through and say that not everybody is ready to have this conversation yet, but it's incumbent upon us as leaders to make this a part of our culture so that it is required. It also is required. It is also something that we're doing in higher ed, because, you know, when we look at this is partly our fault. When Congress says that they can't get through something and they can't have civil discourse, this is because we didn't teach it. And we didn't teach techniques in order to be able to have civil discourse. So this is our fault. So part of this is for us to say we have to have a stopgap measure. We have to incorporate it. We have to make this a part of the onboarding process for every student. And we're doing that now at NAU. We have to make this a part of the classroom experience, because all of what we're seeing for many is our fault, as many of them went through higher education. So for many, they won't get there right away. So it's okay if right now they're saying I'm not uncomfortable, but you have to keep pushing. You have to keep bringing it up. I was that squeaky wheel that constantly said, we have to talk about this. 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 Coconino County, listen, guess what? Everybody in human health and service, over 400 folks have been trained. When we think about the leadership training, now it's a required part of the leadership training because we've been pushing, but that didn't come right away. That took years of saying, listen, listen, listen. And that took years of waiting until that voice continued to grow and allies were around the table to amplify it. So you may be the only ally at the table right now, but if you keep pressing the button, if you keep being the squeaky wheel, I promise you won't be the only ally for long.
And it sounds like you're really talking about perseverance and grit and not giving up. And there are two questions that are tied really similarly because they're both about workplace and they're both about, they might be the last two questions we have time for, but they're about now what. So one of the questions says, this one is a private one. It says, how would you suggest an employee approach supervisors and above to have discourse conversations and address the issues? And then also tied in, Nicole is saying, Ivy, thank you for mentioning that your authentic self should be able to show up in the workplace and that we need to be able to make changes in our workplace for this to happen. But you also mentioned organizations should consider changing practices and policies. This could seem like a heavy lift. So where do you suggest an organization begins the process?
It is the first thing that is to acknowledge it and to number one say, whether it be to establish a diversity and inclusion committee, to establish one person that you can lift some of their current job responsibilities to begin looking and having those conversations with faculty and staff, whether it be at a college level or in your community, or whether you're at a corporation, a small business. There's a way to carve out that time. There's a way to establish a committee. There's a way to reallocate resources from one person so that that person can spend some of their hours either throughout the week or throughout the day focusing on these issues. Where do we start it? That's the one is acknowledge it. Number two is to also to say, we have to be so committed that we are going to carve out this time. For many, it's looking at HR policies, and we're seeing that with the Supreme Court. What policies do you have in place to protect LGBTQIA trans members? What policies do you have in place in order to protect people of color, meaning showing up in their authentic self? I'm pretty transparent. Y'all will know this if you know me. This is definitely a wig on my head, and many days I will show up in my natural hair. For a long time, I couldn't do that as a lawyer. I couldn't show up with my natural hair because it was frowned upon for me to wear my natural hair in its curly state that the great God gave me, right, in the workplace. So it's important for us to look at our policies and policies that may be pretty straightforward on the face, how they're indirectly. I think about maternity and paternity leave, right? How does that impact our LGBTQIA community? How does that indirectly impact families that are look different than the traditional families, or I hate using that word, right? That the policies were designed for. So it's important for us to look at those pieces. So looking at HR, carving out the time to be able to have someone to look through those things, to be able to do surveys, to hear what are the stories and how are bringing people showing up to work. Am I putting on that face? Am I throwing that wig on and making sure that I change my dialect? And that is very important for African-American culture. I do a code switch. So the code switch means that I show up as Ivy right now. You're seeing me with my wig on and you're seeing me code switched. Right? Because that's acceptable for me to show up at work. Is that required at this day and age? No. But it's one of those conversations that we have to have. And in order to hear that, you've got to be willing to listen. And you've got to be willing to say, I'm ready to hear how you're showing up and what your authentic self is. That means carving out the time, having someone that can do some of that heavy lifting. And then that way you can incorporate it into your practices. There was a question real quick by Shai. I get this question a lot. I would ask that you do a little bit of research, and it's not an ignorant question. This is a safe space. I think in order for us to be able to grow, we have to know that we can ask questions and feel uncomfortable. So you usually see my pronouns here as she, her, and hers when I usually introduce myself. For Blacks and African American, I am consider myself Black because there's a difference between those that actually migrated here from Africa and the African countries. There's a difference between the two terms. So there was a question about how, what's the better, best, good term to refer to when you're referring to it in a document. I use Black/African American because I'm talking to a group. But when I develop a rapport with someone, I'll ask how they prefer to be identified. And that's one of the things that you can do at work as part of your process as people are onboarding, right? Think about do you have gender? Do you have more options for gender? Because I might not identify as male and or female. So that's important. I might identify as Black and not as African American. It's important to have those options, and so that people can say, I am showing up as my authentic self, even in the application process, because then I'll know it's an inclusive work environment that promotes civility.
The unfortunate, but actually more fortunate thing is that questions keep streaming in, which is fantastic.
I know,
right?
I see that.
Yeah, and what I want to just take a moment to really thank you for, Ivy, is giving us the safe space to have this conversation, for priming us to think about what are my questions, what could I ask, and for this just to be the beginning. If you had advice for folks in terms of moving forward, like right as once they hang up this call, are there thoughts that you might share? I know Ivy was the one who, when I said, Ivy, what's a resource that I might direct people towards? And she said, how about this podcast? So you may have seen that in my last newsletter. Is there anything else you would suggest?
I would say continue to learn, continue to be a part of these conversations. One of the great books is White Fragility, and there's a lot of great conversations around that. I would say continue to learn. In order to be an ally, you have to be a well-informed and active ally, and not everyone will be ready to show up to the conversation the same as you. So understand everybody's positionality may be a little bit different, and be prepared for that as well. Also, to Christoph's point, very quickly, is that in order to, you have to set the ground rules for civil discourse and say that this is a safe space. So one of the things so thank you, Shai, for, and I hope I'm saying that name right, is to ask a question that you don't know, because we don't know, we've never had these conversations, so it's okay. And to say that this is a private space where you're able to have, a safe space where you're able to have these conversations and you're able to ask questions that you're like, I don't really know. What are pronouns? So it's a safe space. So as you're establishing these rules for civil discourse in your own work environment, ensure that everyone knows that it's a safe space. And with that, that means for both sides to understand that someone may ask a question and you'd be like, how did this is the most, you know what? It's okay. I won't get emotional. I won't get upset. I won't be offended by it, because we're in a space of learning.
You know, as we are wrapping this up, it's something that I've noticed that just even in our conversation here that you've said or offline, you will sometimes even just say, no problem. And I feel like that's such a nice disarming way to in my experience, when I'm having conversations, especially within leadership academies where people are being vulnerable and honest and real and courageous, they still fear messing up because they don't want to offend. And so we talk about, like, every once in a while you are going to offend by accident, and then you can work to fix it. But can you be courageous, and can you have fierce curiosity? And you can tell people, you can communicate about the communication, right? The meta communication. I'm going to ask a question. It's well-intentioned because I'm just curious. Can you help me to understand X? And I think you're really helping us with that. One thing that I want to offer or mention to this group, I've just started working with 3 teams recently within about the last month, and it's a new offering that my company, Lancaster Leadership, is offering. It's either group coaching or one-on-one coaching for leadership teams. The reason I mention it now is because sometimes people will say, like Nicole said, where do we start? or like someone else said, how do I bring this up to my supervisors? These are hard, I want to put in quotes, hard meaning that they're courageous, they're, maybe the better word is important conversations, but sometimes we don't know where to start. So whether it's how do we talk about diversity or equity or inclusion, or how to have difficult conversations, or how to hold people accountable, or how to interact with different personality styles, or how to communicate better, or whatever, there is support out there for you. If you have any interest in learning more about that, always feel free to email me or call me. You'll get this playback from me, so you have my email address there. Just wanted to offer that. Ivy, thank you so much for your time with us. I am immensely grateful. You can see other people are immensely grateful. Anything you'd like to say as we're signing off?
Thank you so much. Keep going, allies, and those that have those lived experiences, keep amplifying your voice. It's much needed.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Everybody have a wonderful day. Feel free to unmute, say your goodbyes, and then bow out once you're ready. Thank you, everybody.
Goodbye. Nice meeting everybody.
Thank you for the session and including me.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Julie. Wonderful.
Where's Julie? Where's Julie?
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye. Bye.
Okay.
Fading quietly. God bless.
Thank you, Celia. You too.
Thanks so much for that opportunity in the right moment. Cheers for now.
My
Bye-bye.
pleasure. Thank you for joining.
Thank you for the invitation. Just had to stay awake because it's past bedtime. Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Thank you for joining us. All right, the meeting's about to close in about 5 more seconds. Thank you so much, everybody.